Since his re-inauguration in May, Vladimir Putin has shown a preference for focusing on Russia's neighbours. His first trip to Belarus, and not the G8 summit at Camp David, was taken as a sign that he considers bolstering Russia's influence in Eurasia more important than handshakes with Barack Obama. In Beijing on Wednesday, President Putin attended the distinctly Eurasian summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the security bloc that includes Russia, China and Central Asian republics. This week in St. Petersburg, he asked European leaders to recognize his common economic space, the new customs union of Russia, Belarus and Kazakhstan.
We are convinced that the formation of the customs union, common economic space and potentially economic union is completely in line with the objective of strengthening cooperation between Russia and the European Union.
Other former Soviet republics are being encouraged to join. Uzbekistan's President Islam Karimov signed a memorandum of understanding in Tashkent on Monday. In fact, the Customs Pact is considered a stepping stone in Putin's grander vision, the creation of a Eurasian Union, where a common currency and even a parliament have been touted. Here in Kazakhstan, Russia is still the country's largest trading partner, although China's not far behind. The Customs Union is designed to protect that relationship and make goods like Chinese imports less competitive. Some worry that economic union with Russia could go too far.
I don't want to say that Russia tries to impose on geopolitical values, geopolitical strategies upon us, but there is a risk. The rudiments of totalitarian system can be seen. Kazakhstan should adopt more cautious attitude.
But while the leaders of Kazakhstan and Belarus back a higher level of integration, plenty of their citizens might still need convincing. Robin Forrester-Walker, Al Jazeera, Almaty.
An anniversary to mark the Christianization of Russia, or Rus as it used to be known 1,025 years ago, has been stirring tensions in Ukraine's capital. This comes on the eve of a two-day visit by Russian President Vladimir Putin. Anti-Russian Ukrainian nationalists have been gathering outside the Russian embassy in Kiev, demonstrating their dissatisfaction with Moscow's policies toward their country. The visit is on one level to celebrate a joint Christian heritage, but Putin is also keen on creating a gas transport consortium and on persuading Ukraine to participate in a customs union, which currently includes Russia, Belarus and Kazakhstan. This is in contrast to Ukraine's drive to join the European Union. The position of the ruling party of regions is that Ukraine should not refuse to participate in the customs union. MP Volodymyr Olinik says, "We believe our interests should be represented everywhere, not only in the European Union, but also within the customs union, where we have economic and cultural interests. We shouldn't refuse to be in it." At the heart of the question which way to turn lies the challenge, some say insurmountable, of belonging to more than one bloc. Ukraine is dependent on Russian natural gas, and disputes over pricing briefly caused supplies to EU countries to be cut off in 2009 and resulted in a controversial gas deal signed by then Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko. Energy and trade make powerful arguments, with all the potential to force Ukraine to make political concessions, such as extending the lease on the port of Sevastopol, which is the base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, in exchange for lower gas prices. This is part of the pressure to join the customs union, Ukrainian former foreign minister and now an opposition MP Boris Tarasyuk explains. He says there have always been political attempts to keep Ukraine subordinate to Russia. This is why geopolitical projects have been created, like the Commonwealth of Independent States, made up of former Soviet republics, and the Eurasian Union, now the Customs Union. Ukrainian politicians, in keeping a balance between Russia and the West, try to limit their obligations in both directions. Public opinion in Ukraine is currently 42% in favor of European integration, with 31% believing Ukraine should join the customs union, and some 13% saying Ukraine should not join either club.
Focus then, and in the past there have been gas wars between Russia and Ukraine. This month has seen a chocolate war as Russia banned imports from Ukraine's favourite confectioner. It even went as far as temporarily imposing such strict condition checks on all Ukrainian goods that exports, well, really they became unviable. But why is Russia doing it? Well, the country is piling pressure on Ukraine to give up on any European ambitions. Ukraine is due to sign a trade deal with the EU this November, something Russia and Vladimir Putin wants to stop, perhaps at any cost. Ons van Kat's Gulliver Cragg reports now from Kiev.
After a costly few days, customs blockages have now been lifted for most Ukrainian exporters to Russia. But Roshen chocolate remains banned, officially on sanitary grounds. Journalists touring the company's factory last week suspect the real reason Roshen has been singled out is that its owner also owns a TV channel.
Putin realizes that he's losing the information war, so he's now targeting the owners of TV channels here via their other businesses.
Roshen's management, who fear huge losses from the Russian ban, were more diplomatic, but equally clear that this is a political, not a sanitary issue.
The Russian export market is very important for us, and we believe that negotiation between government of Ukraine and Russia will bring some quick and fast results.
It seems Russia wanted to give Ukraine a foretaste of the pain its economy would endure if it signs with Brussels and rejects a customs union with Moscow. Ukrainian politicians have dismissed these tactics as bullying and bluff. But some economists believe the EU deal could do serious harm to Ukraine. Vsevolod Stepanyuk says exports to Russia could fall by more than 10% without Europe picking up any slack.
Business conditions are worse in Ukraine than in Europe, which means Ukrainian business cannot make products that will be competitive on the European market, especially not in the high-tech sector.
Pro-European analysts, meanwhile, admit there will be losses in the short term, but say in the long run, Ukraine can become competitive.
When we talk about the free trade agreement with the European Union, it's about adopting European regulations and standards in Ukraine. It's about improving the business climate and attracting FDI, foreign direct investments, from the European Union, which would in turn enable us to produce new goods.
Aside from economic pressure and persuasion, the Kremlin has also been stressing Ukraine's cultural and religious ties to Russia. Vladimir Putin was here last month to celebrate 1,025 years since Vladimir the Great baptized Kiev and Rus and established Christianity across the region. Today, there are two rival Ukrainian Orthodox churches, one ruled by the Moscow Patriarchate, the other independent.
The Russians think that Ukraine's independence is a historic mistake and expect that sooner or later Ukraine will return to them.
The Kiev Patriarchate rejects that idea.
We are categorically against all attempts to bring us back into the Russian Imperium on the pretext of brotherly unity and shared history. We've been there before. We know what it means for Ukraine.
Some Ukrainians are convinced by the Russian arguments.
We've got more in common with Russia than we have with Europe. Guys, seriously.
Nevertheless, according to polls, a clear majority prefers the idea of European integration.
In my circle of friends, everyone thinks Ukraine is part of Europe, and that's how it should be. We don't understand how we're any worse than Bulgaria or Romania.
One big bone of contention remains between Ukraine and the West, however. President Viktor Yanucovich has so far refused to release the former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko, serving jail time on what Brussels says are politically motivated charges. The deputy leader of her party, though, says he's confident this issue will be resolved soon.
Yanucovych doesn't have a choice. If this isn't sorted out now, he will lose the election in 2015 no matter who the opposition candidate is, and then Yulia Tymoshenko will be released anyway.
If neither Europe's leaders nor Viktor Yanucovych soften their stance on Yulia Tymoshenko, they will be handing Russia's Vladimir Putin a victory he sorely craves.
This is Ukraine's largest industrial chocolate maker, and for the last month it's found itself caught up in a trade war. Russia is blocking imports of its chocolates, saying the quality isn't up to scratch. It's angry at plans by Kiev to sign a new trade deal with the EU. Ukraine's Prime Minister says Moscow must accept the new relationship as a reality. Meanwhile, at the Russian factory, they wait for news.
We just received some information from TV, from newspaper, etc., but we didn't receive any documents with concrete claim to the concrete products we are producing and supply to Russia. Till now. Anyway, we are open to inspect our factories. We are open to give any documentation will be necessary.
At the border, Russian customs have been holding up deliveries with extra checks. Political analysts say this is not a typical trade war, but has specific targets. The attack is on leaders of Ukrainian big business, people who play an important role in the Ukrainian economy, because they are the main lobbyists of the European integration of Ukraine. This trade row between the two biggest former Soviet countries deepens the traditional divide in Ukraine between pro-Russian and pro-European. In Soviet times, the chocolate factory was named after Karl Marx. Now the statue outside is the only reminder. Our correspondent in Ukraine says that the trade row that's hitting major Ukrainian companies and capital interests has softened the EU's stance towards the conditions that Kiev must fulfill in order to sign the association agreement in late November.
Sergio Cantone, Euronews, Kiev. You said undeclared trade war. I believe that this is a declared political war. Russia waged the war not just against Ukraine, a political war, but against the European Union. And frankly, it seems to me it's like against Western world. The Berlin Wall fell more than 20 years ago. And there is no reason to construct a new one. And these guys in Moscow, they probably want to build it on the Ukrainian-EU border. No. On the other hand, you indicated President Putin, and frankly speaking, after Vilnius, I would ask President Yanucovich to decorate President Putin with an honorable medal for the European integration of Ukraine. Because, you know, it boosted EU aspirations in Ukraine due to the acts that have been undertaken by Russian Federation. Russians decided to make a punitive actions against Ukraine. And the last but not least, you said about this Zerkalo Nedeli article. We are not an experts in getting the right signature under this action plan. But let's deliberate on it. Look at the actions that Russians are doing and look at the language, what's in this document. They are similar. It seems to me that this action plan is quite authentic.
It's dealt a blow to the EU's Eastern Partnership policy. Armenia has announced that it's joining a customs union led by Russia, turning its back on a European free trade agreement. The decision came after the country's president met with Vladimir Putin. We've exchanged opinions on issues of Eurasian integration, he says, and I confirmed Armenia's wish to enter the customs union and to join the process of forming the Eurasian Economic Union. If all goes to plan, Armenia will not only join its former Soviet master in the Union, but also Belarus and Kazakhstan.
Russia has been using extreme bullying tactics with a number of neighbors. I understand that the president of Armenia went to Moscow, was summoned by President Putin and told that if he went ahead with his Euro-Atlantic aspirations in terms of getting closer to the European Union by having this free trade agreement, that would be the end of the Russian security guarantees.
Armenia's decision is a political boost for Putin, who is struggling to stop Ukraine from turning towards the European Union.
Don't sign on the dotted line. That's the message from Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev as Ukraine eyes a pact with the EU. He said that by sealing the deal, Ukraine will lose all privileges it holds with Moscow. A storm has been brewing over the weekend at the Yalta conference, where President Putin's counselor gave a stark warning to Kiev. The trade barrier with Russia will become more tough. Ukrainian manufacturers will lose Russian, Belarusian and Kazakh markets. Cooperation in machinery will also face a very serious test, since charging import tariffs means the end of cooperation in many branches of the economy. Russia claimed that the measures will affect 35 billion euros worth of Ukrainian goods, threatening a default on its sovereign debt. But far from being intimidated, Ukraine made light of the Kremlin's threats. We're used to this and we aren't afraid of anything. Obviously, we're working on different options of how the situation might go, and of course we hope we'll have the support from the EU. Ukraine is expected to sign a political association and free trade deal at an EU summit in Vilnius in November. However, the continued incarceration of former Premier Yulia Tymoshenko may cause it to fall at the last hurdle.
Ukraine's President Viktor Yanucovych has a major obstacle to overcome if the former Soviet Republic is to sign free trade and association agreements with the European Union. That obstacle's name is Yulia Tymoshenko, as the President has recognized. He says we still have to face the most painful question. This is the question of Tymoshenko. The former Prime Minister, Tymoshenko, has spent most of the past 2 years in a prison hospital with back trouble for an abuse of power conviction in a case which many in the EU consider to have been one of selective or questionable justice. German Foreign Minister Guido Westerwelle, while visiting the Ukrainian capital a few days ago, reiterated that Berlin is willing to help the former Prime Minister and, by implication, Kiev. He said, "We have proposed that Mrs. Tymoshenko be treated in Germany. The proposal remains. It's obviously a contribution to a common solution." Kiev is also under pressure from Russia to join its customs union with Belarus and Kazakhstan. Moscow stepped up checks at its border with Ukraine in August to show it was serious. Ukrainian-made well-known Russian chocolates are not allowed into Russia at the moment. This is an example of just one of the products Kiev is being warned could be banned if it continues on its EU negotiations. Moscow has also been skirmishing over trade with Lithuania, banning dairy products from that EU member state, saying it's to protect consumers. This Lithuanian economist discusses possible other reasons.
The reason behind embargo cannot be economic, because Lithuanian exports make up less than 1% of total Russian food product market. So obviously we have to look for political reasons. It could be many reasons, could be related to possible signing between EU and Ukraine association agreement. It could be related to Lithuania's current negotiation with Gazprom.
Lithuanian President Dalia Grybauskaitė in September spoke out against pressures being brought on Ukraine to force it away from closer EU dealings. Lithuania was the first of the former Soviet republics to declare its independence in 1990.
European foreign ministers have warned Russia to stop putting pressure on Ukraine as the former Soviet country seeks closer ties with the EU. Gathering in Luxembourg on Monday, the EU's foreign ministers are discussing Ukraine's progress towards the signing of a free trade deal with the EU during the Eastern Partnership Summit next November. But Moscow has been pressuring the ex-Soviet member to join the Moscow-led customs union instead, reminding Ukraine of its heavy dependence on Russian gas.
On Eastern Partnership, that's really 5 weeks left until the summit, and we need extra efforts from both sides, from all sides. Partners should deliver definitely, but we also have to support them, to help them to meet this. Now they're facing kind of pressure, as we know, so to help to counter this pressure. Also to think about the measures of irreversibility of the reforms.
Seen as an important step towards EU membership, Ukraine hopes to sign the so-called association agreement, but EU officials warn Ukraine to deliver on a number of conditions, including the release of former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko. Tymoshenko is serving a 7-year sentence for abuse of office, an imprisonment that Brussels considers to be politically motivated.
It's obvious that Ukraine has not yet fulfilled the conditions that are there. And immediately after this meeting, the Radek Sikorski, the Polish foreign minister, and myself, we will go to Chisinau, we'll go to Kiev, and we go to Tbilisi to review those things in the next few days in anticipation of the further moves that might be might be happening.
Foreign affairs ministers will also discuss the situation in the southern neighborhood, with a special focus on Egypt, Syria, Libya and the aftermath of the Lampedusa tragedy.
Thousands of people gathered in Kiev on Friday night for a pro-EU rally. It comes after the Ukrainian government's U-turn on a long-planned EU trade pact and the talk of strengthening ties with Russia instead. Jailed former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko and opposition leader Vitaly Klitschko have called for people to fill the streets until Sunday, the 9th anniversary of the Orange Revolution. Our main task is to get united, because we are united by the desire to live in a better country. What do we have to do? Every one of us has to bring 20, 40, 100 people here. And then, when there are a lot of us, we can go and demand. Ukraine's Prime Minister has defended the suspension of talks with the EU. A purely economic decision, he called it. The gains Ukraine may make on European markets won't compensate for the losses in Russian trade if we go ahead, he explained. But those arguments won't wash with the pro-Europe opposition MPs or the crowds on the streets.
They started under the statue of the national poet, Taras Shevchenko, jailed by a Russian Tsar in the 19th century. A fitting symbol for protesters convinced that last week's events mean Ukraine must once again live under Russian influence. Until last Thursday, it looked like Ukraine was going to sign an association agreement with Europe, marking a major geostrategic shift. But EU leaders wanted this woman, former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko, freed from jail first. In a surprise move, the government refused and broke off talks with Europe, pledging closer ties with Moscow. Tymoshenko's daughter said the government had betrayed the Ukrainian people. Many demonstrators want President Viktor Yanucovich to resign and for talks with Europe to resume immediately.
I believe we are a European nation. Maybe the government doesn't think so, but we think so.
Russia is outdated. It represents the past. I don't want to live in a country where one man decides. I want to live in a country where the people make decisions.
Since the end of the Soviet Union 23 years ago, Ukraine has come under intense pressure from the Kremlin to tighten links. Moscow twice cut off gas supplies during wintertime, and starting last summer began imposing trade barriers that cost this economy billions of dollars. And the Kremlin continues to spend money on politics in this country. Russian money is thought to have helped finance a counter-demonstration in Kiev on Sunday. But according to polls, the pro-Europe protesters represent the majority opinion, where many see closer ties with Europe as the best way of cleaning up their country of corruption in both politics and business. As night fell, there were scuffles, with police using tear gas to disperse protesters gathered outside a government building. The demonstrations were mostly peaceful, but the clash was another sign that whatever the government has decided, many here aren't ready to take no to Europe for an answer.
Let's move to the Ukraine now, where it's thought more than 100,000 people have taken part in a demonstration and march in the capital, Kiev. Well, they've been protesting against the government's decision to scrap an agreement with the European Union. Well, let's look at these live shots now from Kiev. It's pretty dark, but some demonstrators are still out on the streets, as we can see. It all looks relatively calm now, but earlier there were reports of clashes on the streets. Both police and demonstrators are reported to have used tear gas. Well, the government announced last week that it was pulling out of a deal on closer ties, saying that it couldn't afford to break relations with its powerful neighbour, Russia.
Nine years after Ukraine's pro-Western Orange Revolution, up to 100,000 people have staged Kiev's biggest protest ever since. Marching in defence of a European future for their country, they denounced the government's U-turn over EU integration. Dismayed at the decision to abandon an association deal with the EU just days before it was to be signed, this woman says today's no longer about policy or any individual political party, it's about our values. There are not only political flags here, but many Ukrainian flags and EU flags too. There were ugly scenes as riot police held back some demonstrators who tried to force their way into government buildings. Under pressure from Moscow, President Viktor Yanucovich has chosen to revive ties with Russia rather than turning to the West. Jailed opposition leader Yulia Tymoshenko had urged people to take to the streets in protest, and her daughter addressed the crowd.
I think that it's just the beginning of this revolution that will take us to Europe. And we only have 5 days. And we believe that if people will stay here and fight with politicians together, we are able to make sure power and the government of Ukraine signs.
It's the first time that such a huge crowd is taken to the street in Kiev since the Orange Revolution. The government of Azarov and President Yanucovych didn't actually expect such a reaction by the Ukrainians. Sergio Cantone, Euronews, Kiev.
We've come here to show that we feel European, so said one of the tens of thousands of Ukrainians marching through Kiev to denounce their government's U-turn over EU integration. Urged to take to the streets by jailed opposition leader Yulia Tymoshenko, tight security surrounded the demonstrators, and while many have been protesting peacefully, scuffles have taken place. Here, a tent set up by rival communists was torn to pieces amid cries of shame. Nearby, a rally was being held in support of the government. President Viktor Yanucovych had been due to sign a landmark deal with the EU next week, but he came under pressure from Russia, Ukraine's biggest trading partner and main source of gas, to join a Moscow-led customs union instead.
The protesters wanted to take their case personally to the government, but police weren't taking any chances. And so the standoff turned into an impromptu rally with a heavyweight speaker. Boxing champion and national sports star Vitaly Klitschko, leader of the sizable Punch faction in parliament, pleading the case for closer European ties.
More than 20 years we have a hope to make changes in our country, to be a modern country with a good economy, with good laws, but it's nothing changed. Exactly the same time, another country who have exactly the same start position, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, Hungary, already a European country.
Riot police are allowing demonstrators to gather here on Independence Square, scene of the historic 2004 Orange Revolution. But the government appears to be taking measures against opposition leaders, rerouting their planes, for instance. One was unable to attend the big rally on Sunday, and another was unable to visit the jailed former Prime Minister, Yulia Tymoshenko.
And what our government is doing at the moment is horrible, and we feel ashamed. That's why we are standing here to show them that we disagree and that we think different.
We are supporting the values of European Union, and I personally want Ukrainian values, the values of Ukrainian citizens, to be close to the values of citizens of European Union.
Even though the government has announced it's giving up on signing the deal, the foreign minister says he will attend the summit where it was to be signed on Friday, adding more confusion in the capital, where, at nightfall, more and more people came to stand in the square after their day's work to say yes to Europe. Nick Spicer, Al Jazeera, Kiev. The protesters wanted to take their case personally to the government, but police weren't taking any chances. And so the standoff turned into an impromptu rally with a heavyweight speaker. Boxing champion and national sports star Vitaly Klitschko, leader of the sizable Punch faction in parliament, pleading the case for closer European ties.
More than 20 years we have a hope to make changes in our country, to be a modern country with a good economy, with good laws, but it's nothing changed. Exactly the same time, another country who have exactly the same start position. Poland, Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, Hungary, already European country.
Riot police are allowing demonstrators to gather here on Independence Square, scene of the historic 2004 Orange Revolution. But the government appears to be taking measures against opposition leaders, rerouting their planes, for instance. One was unable to attend the big rally on Sunday, and another was unable to visit the jailed former Prime Minister, Yulia Tymoshenko.
But even behind bars, she is piling on the pressure, pledging an indefinite hunger strike unless Ukraine signs the association agreement with Europe.
My mom wrote a letter today to the Maidan to say that she's really proud of Ukrainians, she's proud to be Ukrainian, and she is announcing this indefinite hunger strike in support of all those who are there.
Meanwhile, President Viktor Yanucovich, who has been under intense financial pressure from Russia, addressed the people for the first time since his government announced the deal would not be signed.
I want there to be peace and tranquility in our big European family. As a father cannot leave the family without a piece of bread, I have no right to leave people with all the problems which can emerge because of the pressures we are under right now. Production plants will stop and millions of citizens will be thrown into the streets.
But for now, the citizens coming onto the streets in the greatest number are those who think Yanukovych would have better served his country by getting closer to Europe. Nick Spicer, Al Jazeera, Kiev.
Emotions are still running very high. Far fewer people on the street right now. It's Monday, a work day. There are a few thousand gathered on two of the main squares in the center of Kiev and also near government buildings. Also, as you heard, there were clashes where police used tear gas. These seem to be isolated, but it shows that the tensions are indeed high. And there are protesters who are spending the night on the square, which is an echo of the Orange Revolution 9 years ago when protesters occupied for weeks the center of Kiev. But of course, this is a step down from yesterday when we saw maybe 100,000 people gather in the streets. That was the largest protest since President Viktor Yanukovych became president 3 years ago, and possibly the largest protest since the Orange Revolution.
And can you just describe, why people are so angry about this? Obviously, there's the pull towards the EU and the pull towards Russia.
Well, the people who are demonstrating obviously are for the EU agreement. There are others who are either against the agreement or for pulling closer to Russia. They're focused mostly in the eastern part of the country. But those who showed up yesterday, and their numbers are considerable as we saw, feel betrayal because they said President Yanukovych had promised that they were going to sign this free trade and political agreement with the EU in Vilnius, Lithuania at the end of the week, and then at the last minute changed his mind. And they felt betrayed, they told me.
Once again, the anger in the Ukrainian capital Kiev spilled over into scuffles and minor violence. The protesters here feel they're fighting for the future of the country, a European future, not a Russian one. They've been shocked into action by their government's decision to postpone an agreement to build closer ties with the European Union.
We came onto the streets to show them that we are not afraid. And if they don't sign it, it will be a catastrophe for this government. It won't be a catastrophe for Ukraine, because eventually it will get signed anyway, by this president or the next president. We'll get what we want.
The country is divided on whether Ukraine's future should be with the European Union or Russia. But those who favour Europe, like the heavyweight boxing champion turned politician Vitaly Klitschko, are certainly the most vocal at the moment. Yesterday's much bigger rally also ended in clashes between protesters and the police. At one point, the crowd swelled to 100,000, and in scenes reminiscent of the Orange Revolution 9 years ago, the demonstrators started setting up permanent encampments in the city centre, an attempt to secure a foothold for much bigger protests in the days ahead. But no one knows whether the people of Ukraine have the desire or the energy to rise up again. Daniel Sanford, BBC News, Moscow.
Violent clashes erupted in the Ukrainian capital Kiev as more than 100,000 people protested against a government decision to delay an association deal with the EU. Riot police and angry demonstrators fought each other in front of government buildings as one group tried to break into the cabinet of ministers' offices. The protest was the biggest Ukraine's seen since the 2004 Orange Revolution. Pro-EU supporters want Ukraine's President Viktor Yanucovich to sign the trade pact with the European Union as agreed during a summit in Lithuania on Friday. His decision to pull out due to pressure from Moscow has been roundly condemned by Ukraine's top opposition figures. The leader of the Motherland Party said, "Our mission is to block the government until the government cancels its shameful decision and opens the way to the European Union." Protesters have set up a tent city in the capital, vowing to stay there until they get their way. Ukraine's U-turn stunned European leaders last week. The government explained it could not afford to break ties with Russia, which is trying to bring Kiev into its own customs union.
Secret meetings, threats of sanctions and a last-minute reversal. They've all led to the biggest demonstrations in Ukraine in almost 10 years. Are the Russians to blame? And will people's anger force Ukraine's government into yet another reversal? This is Inside Story. Hello there, a warm welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. It's been an astonishing turnaround by the government in Ukraine, ending hopes of a trade deal with the European Union. These pictures are from Sunday, when riot police came out in force to control tens of thousands of protesters. They're angry at the government's reversal and demonstrated in front of President Viktor Yanucovych's palace. Ukraine backed out of a deal which was due to be signed with the EU on Friday after several secret meetings with Russia. The public show of force was the largest seen since the Orange Revolution in 2004, during which peaceful protests brought a Western-leading government to power. This time, the number of protesters has not been sustained, and the government is showing no signs of backing down. The protesters, however, are defiant. Here's what some of them have been saying.
I came here to demand a better country, for my children and grandchildren to have a future and a better life. Out with this authority, out.
I believe we are a European nation. Maybe the government doesn't think so, but we think so.
Russia is outdated. It represents the past. I don't want to live in a country where one man decides. I want to live in a country where the people make decisions.
President Yanucovych has appealed for calm.
Everybody has his own point of view on acts in history. But I would like to ask people not to politicize this difficult historical event. This will create tensions between people and make a disconnect in our society.
Now, Russia and Ukraine share much of their history, but since the fall of the Soviet Union, relations have been tense. In the 1990s, they were marred by territorial disputes. They signed a friendship treaty in 1997, which brought a period of improved relations. But the Orange Revolution in 2004 again raised problems. And in 2009, Russia cut off gas supplies to Ukraine in a dispute over prices. That caused mid-winter fuel shortages across Europe. Moscow also opposed Kiev's desire to become a member of NATO. The Kremlin ramped up the pressure, and in October, Ukraine gave up that bid. So, with this checkered past in mind, let's explore why Ukraine has again turned back to the old Soviet fold. And here to do just that, we have today joining us Ostap Semerak in Kiev. He's an advisor to the opposition group Batkivshena. In Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer, a defense analyst and columnist for Russia's online news website Novaya Gazeta. And in London, Lilit Gevorgian, a specialist on Russia and the former Soviet states for IHS Global Insight. OK, first of all, let's take you back to those protests that we saw, especially on Sunday. And Ostap, just how strong is the anger in Ukraine over its backing out of this EU deal?
So the question is that on this Friday we have to sign or not to sign association agreement in Vilnius during the summit of EU Eastern Partnership. And as you know, President of Ukraine, Viktor Yanucovich, announced that he is going to sign this agreement, but unfortunately last week Ukrainian government stopped this process, and just for today we have extraordinary situation when government stopped this process, but president still has right and choice to do this, and we expect that he will do this. And yesterday and a few days ago, a lot of people, 100,000 of people on streets of Kiev and all around the country supported this European integration process.
We should note, though, Ostap, shouldn't we, just to jump in for a moment, because we should note that today, Monday, those numbers have diminished quite rapidly, and we're not seeing more than 1,000 people out on the streets. So are they going to be sustained?
I'm talking about tomorrow, about Sunday. We had 100,000 people in Kiev. That's only in Kiev, but on other cities in Ukraine we also had a lot of meetings. Today, Monday, today is working day, and a great rain in Kiev. We have we have less people, but we appointed a meeting at 7 o'clock the evening. So let's see in 3 hours what will be, but still we are keeping this not ending meeting till summit on Vilnius.
The president has called on protesters not to politicize this issue, but it is political, isn't it?
This process was started not by political parties, but by the civil society and NGOs. And after political parties joined this process, but we have to understand that signing or not signing this agreement, that is political choice, and that is not choice between East or West for my country. That is choice between future and past. And we understand, a lot of people in Ukraine, or majority in Ukraine, understand that signing these documents with the European Union, that is start of great reforms in Ukraine. This document contains 1,000 pages, and that is great. Very detailed program of reforms for my country, and that is very important. We are not against our neighbors. We want to have good future for our children.
Okay, Pavel, let's bring you in here and just try to get to the bottom of what was behind this turnaround. Talk of secret meetings with Putin. What was the context of those meetings?
Russia has been for already half a year, very seriously pressing Kiev not to sign this agreement. And so right now for Moscow, this is some kind of, bonus that this happened, that actually didn't happen, that the agreement has not been signed. And Russia was telling Ukraine that very serious economic and political sanctions, especially punishing economic sanctions, would be imposed. And actually, some sanctions have been already imposed on some Ukrainian companies, and Ukrainian-Russian trade has been diminished. And Russia was offering also perks to Ukraine, saying that it will, if Ukraine does not sign the agreement with the European Union, if Ukraine instead signs into a customs union with Moscow, Ukraine will get cheaper natural gas, and they'll get other kind of perks, and everything is going to be good for Ukraine. And if it does not sign, and everything is going to be bad for Ukraine if it does sign. And President Yanucovych actually said recently that it was kind of Russian blackmail that moved him into not signing and backing out of this agreement, though later that was not fully confirmed. So yes, this is a very important thing. Apparently the Kremlin agrees with what was said once by a veteran American political scientist, Zbigniew Brzezinski, that with Ukraine, Russia is always an empire. Without Ukraine, Russia is never an empire. So the Kremlin agrees, and the Kremlin sees as critical the participation of Ukraine in the Russian-led integration of post-Soviet states named as the coming Eurasian Union.
Absolutely. We'll be looking a little bit more at that slightly later in the programme. First of all, Lilith, do you agree? Do you see this move as one of blackmail on the part of Russia?
I think it's quite simplistic approach. I have to disagree with the term blackmail. I think there were a number of factors that came into play during the negotiations. First of all, because both European Union and Russia have been struggling and fighting over Ukraine, either sides were trying to truck the country into their respective bloc. It has put Kiev in some sort of a peculiar position where it could have picked and chose which policies or which offer would have benefited the country the most. The issue is that economically speaking, Ukraine is in a dire state and it has immediate financial assistance needs. In the past 2-3 months, we've noticed that there have been discussions, ongoing negotiations with IMF and the EU about this issue as well. EU has effectively said to Ukraine that they have to go through some painful macroeconomic decisions to unlock this financial assistance. On the other hand, Russians also have financial and economic leverages over Ukraine, and in terms of the immediate gains, it appears that the Russian offer was much more appealing. And secondly is the political, and it concerns the current government and more precisely the current president who's looking for re-election in early 2015.
Ostap, I mean, that's a fair point, isn't it, Ostap, that short term, Ukraine does benefit more from a deal with Moscow than it does from the EU, which would involve plenty of reforms and the costs that those entail.
You know, that's not true to say that what we will get in the short terms, because we really do not know what's the proposition. But I want to stress that for my country, these agreements with the European Union, that's not the deal about money. That's the deal about reforms in my country. And we understand that in short terms, probably it will be hard for our society and for our economy. But in a long term, in medium terms, we have great example with Poland, with other countries, with the changes in economy, in society, with democracy and with the freedom in my country, and that is the best deal. And you know, more than 50% of people in my country are ready to pay this to be free, and probably we will be successful in this way.
There's also another key demand of both the protesters and the EU that's causing trouble with the government, and that's the release of the former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko. Now, she's become a symbol of Ukraine's troubled democracy, and on Sunday her daughter had this message.
All I can say is that the Ukrainian people, as well as the opposition, should fight and stand for our national interests, for the fulfillment of the conditions by the president, and to sign the agreement. The chance still exists. We hope that it will happen and that it becomes a reality.
Lilith Gevorgian, to what extent did the EU demands for Tymoshenko's release cause Ukraine to back away? To what extent is she still a central figure in this battle over Ukraine?
I think it was important both for Ukrainian government and for some European leaders, I have to say here, because the Tymoshenko issue has been discussed for so long, and some strong messages have been said by European Union, some European Union leaders as well. So there's an overwhelming feeling that they cannot really backtrack on this issue. However, had the both parties wanted really to press ahead with this deal, I think they could have found a solution to Tymoshenko issue, maybe an interim one, maybe her visit, a long visit to Germany. But the point is that because the deal has fallen through, the issue now appears to be much more serious than in reality it was.
Ostap, how much of a threat do you think Tymoshenko does pose to the government, the current government?
I said that Tymoshenko is one of the strongest oppositional political leader, and I am absolutely agree that Yanucovych is afraid about his re-election, and that is the main problem of her keeping in a jail. So that is politically motivated prosecution, and that is absolutely understandable why European Union demand to overcome this problem of politically motivated prosecution, and Tymoshenko is one of the best example of that. And I really feel that government, and especially President Yanucovych, they are afraid about her being in a political process, and they try to keep her out of the political process, and we do not have even free opportunity to communicate with her when she is in a jail and in a hospital, jail hospital.
Pavel, clearly Tymoshenko does represent a threat to the current government. To what extent do you think this deal with Moscow is about President Yanukovych's re-election in 2015?
Well, obviously, for Viktor Yanucovych, the main problem is the holding on to power. And also, he is following the tradition of Ukrainian foreign policy since Leonid Kuchma, who was two-term president of Ukraine, and Yanucovych was his prime minister, actually. It's trying to play the West against the East, to kind of go to the West and say, if you won't give us perks and if you won't give us money, we'll go to Moscow. Then going to Moscow and saying, if you will not give us lower prices for gas and some kind of loans, and then we're going to go to the West. And Kiev was actually trying to play it out right now with this coming Vilnius summit, and actually I believe they overplayed their hand. Right now, both Brussels and Moscow are saying flat, either you have a free trade agreement with us, or you have a free trade agreement with them. And I don't believe that there is any right now solid agreement between Kiev and Moscow. Because in Moscow they say, okay, if they postpone the signing of the association and free trade with Brussels, that's wonderful. But then they have to sign into the Russian-led customs union. And only then they're going to get what Russia has offered them. So right now the Ukrainian government and President Yanucovych are caught in the middle. They're not getting much from both sides, and right now are actually a bit in a distress. And of course, it's a not very popular government to begin with. And there's not only right now Tymoshenko, there's Viktor Klitschko, the champion heavyweight boxer, who's also a very powerful right now political figure. So Yanucovych is in a rather bad slot, as he is right now, not being in good relations with either Moscow or Brussels,
and
or with his own people.
Is it not unfair of the EU and Russia to put countries such as Ukraine in such a position where they have to choose? I mean, is it not the responsibility of these bigger nations and group of nations to allow both paths to exist simultaneously?
Well, that's what President Vladimir Putin was saying. We also want an agreement of free trade with the European Union, but we will better get a better deal if we go in as a big customs union. Brussels says no. If you have a customs union, with Moscow, no free trade agreement with us, because right now the Russian-led customs union has different. A lot of the technicalities of needed for trade are different in Europe and in Moscow, in Russian-led integration union. So this is not easy to put together, and so Ukraine is actually in a position when they have to choose, which is against their political instincts. They have been deliberately not fully choosing for a very long time. The Ukrainian political elite does not want to become, like in the Soviet times, a kind of just simply Russian viceroy sitting in Kiev.
Okay.
At the same time, they don't want to fully break relations with Moscow too.
Okay, we're just going to look a little ahead now, as we have been talking about the Vilnius summit, which is starting at the end of this week. Now, that's where the EU is still going to be inviting a number of other former Soviet states to join its so-called association agreement. And German Chancellor Angela Merkel had this to say to Russia. The countries decide on their own. No third country has a right to impose a veto. And then, apparently to reassure Moscow, she did add that the EU's association agreements with 6 Eastern European countries are not directed against Russia. Russia is our strategic partner. The European Union wants to cooperate with Russia. Lilith, what pressure have we seen Russia putting on other countries to not sign this EU agreement, being forced to make that choice that Pavel was talking about?
Well, Armenia is the recent example, and what we're seeing has happened with the Ukrainian U-turn. We've seen Armenia doing it in early September. After a meeting with the Russian president, the Armenian president announced that the deal, which was more or less finished and ready to be initialed, it was abandoned. However, I have to be very clear that the conditions that Armenia is facing and the level of dependency that Armenia has on Russia, particularly in terms of the security, cannot be compared to Ukraine. Ukraine is a heavyweight compared to Armenia, and it had also other choices to a degree. So, but in the sense of the pressure exercised on the members of Eastern Partnership countries, I think Armenia is a very good example.
Okay, I'm just going to keep it moving because we are running a bit out of time. Pavel, to what extent is this a big boost for Putin and his Eurasian Union trading bloc, which of course he's looking to form by 2015?
Well, of course, I mean, it seems to be a big bonus, though it's not clear how it's going to work out further on. The Ukrainian government says that maybe they'll sign this association agreement in January. They're not closing the option fully. Most likely they're waiting what kind of offer Moscow's going to come up with. Also, Moscow hopes that the present massive protest demonstrations in Ukraine will titter out by the end of the year, and there will be no political changes in Ukraine, and we will be able to continue to negotiate with the Yanucovich administration. But of course, Ukrainian politics are not fully, I mean, from the Russian point of view, not fully understandable. No one knows for sure who will be Yanucovych re-elected or not. There's a very strong opposition. There's a split political elite, a split country, and so Moscow hopes that Yanucovych will stand out the storm and move in our direction. But this is not a foregone conclusion, and everyone understands that.
Yeah, okay. And Ostap, will that be a great loss for the Ukraine if it does move towards Moscow and abandon the EU?
You know, as I mentioned, more than half of Ukrainian people wants to go to association agreement with European Union, and when we are talking about future of Ukraine, comparing these two, custom union and European Union, we understand that my country can be stronger when we will be reformed and when we will have chance to be in a big European family and we feel us as Europeans. And on the other hand, we understand that Putin is playing game to make Ukraine weaker, and he is not playing game to make Yanucovych stronger and to re-elect him in Ukraine. And we have to remember 2004 year when Putin supported Yanucovych and he was failed.
Okay.
So we are standing on the way to be reunited in our big European family.
And Lilith, last 30 seconds to you. Is the Ukraine ready to be further integrated into the EU?
Well, it appears not at the moment. The country seems to be still divided. I do agree that long-term, both economically and politically, Ukraine needs a convergence with the European Union. However, at the short term, both the opposition parties and the government have to be much more honest, less populist, take care of the economy, pull it out from the recession, and get a stronger negotiating position,
right,
and really prioritize the goals of the country,
okay,
both for the economic and political development.
Lilith, there we have to leave it. Thank you very much to all our guests for joining us in today. In Kiev, Ostap Samarak, in Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer, and in London, Lilith Gevorgian. And thanks very much to you two for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want to send us any of your comments, do email us your thoughts at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me and the whole team here, goodbye for now.
Songs of protest on the streets of Kiev, their refrain, "It's hard to be still in prison." Their message was clear. As day turned to night, the demonstrations swelled in size. The momentum was being kept up. But the message from President Viktor Yanucovych was equally clear. The money being offered by the European Union was not nearly enough for the Ukraine.
610 мільйонів євро.
610 million euros budgeted is a technical help for Ukraine. Starting from 2010, 3 years in a row, they were showing us this candy in a nice wrapper, and they were saying, "You will get it when you sign an agreement with the IMF." I don't want to be rude, but you don't have to humiliate us like this. You know, we are not little children. You can't buy us with sweet candy.
They say that beggars can't be choosers, but President Yanucovych is obviously proving very choosy. He prefers Russia's charity to the European Union's.
The protests have remained largely peaceful so far. They're nothing like the scale of the Orange Revolution in 2004. But the feeling of betrayal is strong, buoyed by the hunger strike of their imprisoned former Prime Minister, Yulia Tymoshenko. The opposition accuses the government of using the European negotiations to get a better deal for cheaper gas and loans from Moscow.
If you want to swallow Ukraine, to swallow Moldova, there are good solutions. Yeah, just give enough money to the present Ukrainian government through international institutions. They will sign.
President Yanucovych still means to go to the European summit in Lithuania. He says his decision not to sign a deal is just a pause in the move towards the West, to avoid the country becoming a battleground between the EU and Russia. David Chater, Al Jazeera, Kiev.
Pro-European protesters clashing with police for a second day in the capital of Ukraine. Now, the demonstrators are angry that their government suspended talks on a deal with the European Union. CNN's Phil Black is following the story for us from our Moscow bureau. And, OK, what's behind all of this? What's got these protesters so angry about their government's decision?
Well, Michael, at the end of this week, the Ukrainian government was supposed to sign a free trade and political association agreement or agreements with the European Union. They've been working on these for years. The negotiations have been going for a very long time. And the goal of these agreements is to integrate Ukraine more closely with the European Union. Many have viewed it as an historic opportunity. And those people who are on the streets of Kiev, they are among those who are angry because they saw these agreements as a chance to open Ukraine up to European business, ideas, rule of law, standards, a way of really modernising Ukraine's economy and political system much more rapidly. It would have been an historic step if they had proceeded, because it would have decisively taken Ukraine further from the orbit, from the influence of its old Soviet master, Moscow. Now, it is no secret that Russia did not want Ukraine to sign on with the European Union in this way. There's been a lot of talk about pressure from Moscow through the negotiating process. And today, in response to the Ukrainian government's decision, the most senior officials from the European Union in Brussels have effectively accused Russia of bullying Ukraine into making this decision. They say that they're aware of the external pressure Ukraine has been under, and they disapprove strongly of Russia's position and actions in this. Russia, on the other hand, denies pressuring Ukraine in any way and accuses the EU of trying to blackmail the Ukrainian government into signing on with it. Mike.
How broad is public support for getting in with the European Union, and what is it that those people on the street think they would get out of such a relationship?
Well, it's said to be somewhere roughly 50-50, much like the problem with Ukraine historically has always been this divide down the centre. Half the country to the east is more closely aligned culturally, ethnically with Russia. To the west, they see themselves more culturally distinctive as Ukrainian and more European. But opinion polls tend to show a majority of support, or very close to a majority of support, for signing on with the EU, for going the EU track. Many people believe that is where the future of the country lies. And they believe that that is where a more reliable, more sustainable level and method of governance and growing the economy, growing the political system can be found. So those people on the street genuinely believe that a brighter future for their country can be found if they move more closely in line with the European Union.
You might think this is a Russian dance. In fact, it was developed in Ukraine, and these protesters in Kiev have no intention of dancing their gopak to the Kremlin's tune. It's also a very useful way of getting the blood moving again after another sub-zero night camped out on Independence Square. Irina is taking part in the demonstrations because she believes such an important decision on Europe should not be made by just a handful of politicians in Kiev. It should be made by all the people.
I'm a huge optimist and a romantic, but I'm 95% sure our President Viktor Yanucovich won't sign the agreement. There is still hope though, and I'll stay here for that remaining 5%.
The day started with the national anthem. Ukraine hasn't died yet, nor glory nor freedom, they sang. Taras is a veteran protester, now 73 and a great-grandfather. He took part in the Orange Revolution in Ukraine 9 years ago. He credits that revolutionary spirit with helping him survive 3 cardiac arrests. It certainly hasn't dimmed his appetite or his determination to see his country move towards Europe.
I think the youth of our country will eventually achieve integration with the rest of Europe, but we don't expect any help from that convict, our president. He's a cunning man.
The strong-arm tactics used by the Kremlin to keep Ukraine out of the European Union threaten a new low in relations between Russia and Brussels.
The focus will now move to the summit in Lithuania, where the president of Ukraine will have some explaining to do to his counterparts in Vilnius. But the demonstrations here will continue even when he returns. The organizers are predicting a big turnout this weekend.
Welcome to the program, Mr. Kasyanov.
Thank you.
Tell me what on earth is going on in the mind of the president of Ukraine. He has gone to this summit in Vilnius, and yet he is not joining up or signing on to this European trade deal. Why not?
I think we shouldn't see this as a consolation overall policy vis-à-vis deeper integration with the European Union. I think the issue is very simple. Mr. Yanucovych, president of Ukraine, has pressure from the East, from Vladimir Putin in particular, and not enough of promises from the West.
I mean, let's face it, Ukraine is in about the 5th year of a bad recession. The currency is near collapse. As you said, it's got no IMF lifeline, huge debts and burdens. Surely it would have been more useful to join the EU free trade. What is the pressure that is coming from Putin and why?
First, To join free trade zone with the European Union, it means a long-standing position, that is strategic position, it's a strategic choice. But next year, current problems, payments, and great big deficit of the budget. And when there are no promises, I think just those people who are not prepared to take risks for the reforms, which usually politicians take in the West, and they got afraid. But I think it's absolutely clear for me that in 2015, in March 2015, there will be presidential elections in Ukraine. And for Mr. Yanucovych, that's the only chance to be elected, that's to join this agreement. It means that was only postponement of signing. I'm sure that next year, 2014, Mr. Yanucovych and the whole government of Ukraine will sign this agreement, and that will be the beginning of presidential campaign.
Why does Putin want Ukraine in its sphere right now? Why does Putin want to take on these massive debts, the collapsing currency, all these protesters from all over the country who want to join Europe? Why does Putin want Ukraine to be more allied with Russia than with Europe?
The problem is that Mr. Putin changed his policy. When we were together, I was in office, our priority on foreign policy was also deep integration with the European Union.
That was his first term.
And with his first term, and I was in the Prime Minister's office. And we moved towards this direction. And we led the whole process. Ukraine was together with us. Then suddenly, Mr. Putin, 1 year after my departure, just changed his policy and appeared to be that European Union not just a friend but competitor, if not to say just to use more strong word on that. That's why just in his policy to move in different direction, he tries to secure Ukraine together with Russia.
So tell me, what is going on? Let's have a status report on what's going on inside the political machinations of President Putin. Why has he changed so dramatically? Why do we have this repression of political rights in Russia? Why do we have the arrest of the 30 Greenpeace activists, the anti-propaganda law, which is causing such a problem maybe for the Sochi Olympic Games? Arresting Pussy Riot and putting them in jail. What is happening inside Mr. Putin's head right now?
The problem is Mr. Putin made a dramatic mistake in 2004 and 2005. Then instead of try to be elected as he did in the year 2000, in 2004 that was already manipulation. 2008 it was manipulation of appointing Mr. Medvedev, just temporarily occupying the post of president, etc. And since that time, we don't have elections in Russia. We have imitation of elections. That's a crucial mistake. And in this policy, Mr. Putin, since 2005, didn't pursue any reform. Russia badly needs reforms because the structure of economy and the position in the economy is very fragile. As soon as oil prices fall down, it will be social disaster. Even with this high oil price, we have problems now. We have no GDP growth. We have already for a year no growth of industrial output. We're facing big problems next year already. Mr. Putin, that's responsible for that. He just lost the, I would say, gold period when oil prices and gas prices were high. And Russia could achieve a lot and could jump up in its development. Simply those money were eaten. And just we have such, I would say, undertakers, as you correctly described, just political prisoners appeared again, like in Soviet Union. That's absolutely wrong direction. And Ukraine suffering because of this, because of change of policy internally and externally.
You're a politician, you're still politically active. Where do you see the hope for any kind of democratic, reasonably transparent, representative politics taking place right now?
Me and my party partners, we absolutely have no doubts that the only way is peaceful transformation. Peaceful transformation means elections. We don't have elections. We achieved a little bit. My party finally has been registered, but not because of desire of Mr. Putin, but because of decision of European Court of Human Rights. We continue to consolidate democratic opposition, and it's a difficult process, but we're doing this. Next year will be Moscow Duma city council elections, which is important, could be ranking number 4, and we consolidate, we built a coalition, and I think we have a chance to do this. And I don't believe that Mr. Putin already just lost his, I would say, mind in terms of making himself as a dictator, full dictator. I don't think he will stand forever, as in our history sometimes happens. I think he should think about exit strategy, and we can help him to build it up.
The Ukrainian president refuses to free the jailed opposition leader, Yulia Tymoshenko. She's now gone on hunger strike in support of these protesters. What is the future of dissent, human rights, people like Tymoshenko who want to challenge the system, whether in Ukraine or in Russia?
I think in Ukraine that's a little bit easier situation than in Russia. Unfortunately, we now just have political prisoners. That's we can say that peaceful demonstrators of 2012, which are already more than 1 year in jail, without any special, I would say, incrimination, and they did nothing to be in jail. Pussy Riot group also, these girls in jail for nothing. And many other scientists and even businessmen, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, for instance, continue to be there. That's why we believe that political prisoners exist in Russia. Mr. Putin doesn't want to admit that. But the problem is Russia is a full member of the Council of Europe. And Russia ratified European Charter of Human Rights, European Convention of Human Rights and Political Freedoms. And Russia right now doesn't implement any of those positions. That's what the question is to European leaders. Why Mr. Putin managed to get a special ticket not to implement international obligations? If in other European countries some problems appear, immediate reaction visible. If in Russia continue everyday violations take place, nothing takes place. Russia, a strong country, of course, Russia supplies a lot of natural gas, but that should not be some kind of compromise, that people, leaders should not close their eyes on those violations in Russia. And that's why there should not be, I would say, compromise on principles.
On that note, former Prime Minister Kasyanov, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Thank you.
Ukraine's national anthem, led by former Eurovision winner Ruslana. Tens of thousands of people are holding a vigil in the capital Kiev to urge the Prime Minister to sign a trade deal with Europe. Taking part was the biggest ever student demonstration in Kiev. They want the government to rethink its decision to suspend preparations for the deal with the EU in favour of closer economic ties with Russia.
Our demand is in one word: to sign. We always had a hope. We had hope when we were fighting Bolsheviks, when we were bombed by Nazis. We had hope when we separated from the Soviet Union. There was always hope, and there will always be.
Our history is Europe, and in future we need to build on the history. Not with the customs union, not with Asia. We should be in Europe. As the EU summit in the Lithuanian capital Vilnius gets underway, protesters say they'll stay until the summit ends. Euronews correspondent in Kiev says, although the government has already stated that the association agreement was not to be signed, the protesters still hold out hope. They expect that on the last day of the Vilnius summit something might change, so they're going to hold street rallies at least until Friday night.
Despite last-minute attempts by European leaders at the summit in Lithuania to get him to change his mind, Ukraine's President Viktor Yanucovich refused to sign up to the free trade deal on offer. And the President of the European Commission ruled out his suggestion for trilateral talks on his country's future to include Moscow.
So for a bilateral agreement between the European Union and Ukraine, there should be no trilateral format. The times of limited sovereignty are over in Europe.
In Kiev, Yanukovych supporters were streaming into the city to mount a demonstration showing their approval for his decision, which followed intense pressure from Moscow to retain ties to Russia.
There are reasons why the agreement wasn't signed. The European Union refused to make any concessions to our demands, and we don't want to be brought to our knees. We are a proud people.
We need to finish our own reforms first, and only then can we integrate into Europe and match their standards.
These are the pro-Yanucovich supporters filing into European Square. One thing you notice is they're much more regimented, much more subdued, and they're all on $18 a day expenses.
Only a few hundred meters away from the presidential rally, the pro-European protesters were maintaining their vigil in Independence Square, pledging to continue the demonstrations over the weekend. Opposition leaders now fear that President Yanucovych could order a crackdown on the rallies.
Much will depend on how many people we have on the streets this night and what happens next, because their line of argument is have as much police as possible and have some violent provocations and crush the uprising in the cradle.
The pro-European rallies are expected to continue throughout the weekend, and the students here say they will continue to mount their own protests next week.
In Kiev, thousands of Ukrainians continue to protest against the government's decision to hold off on signing a deal with the EU, with some keeping a round-the-clock vigil. President Yanucovych claims he cannot afford to turn his back on Moscow, but the protesters would rather look to the West. I don't want to grow up in a Soviet system as my parents did. I don't want my children not knowing what democracy is. I don't want to be humiliated when I receive my visas. Even Ukraine's stars turned out to voice their support for the demo.
There was something in my heart I wanted to express to these people, and I'm very grateful to them for their really European position, because this unification we can see here, it's really European.
If the summit concludes with no sign of a signature, the protests could escalate as they did in 2004 during the Orange Revolution. Our correspondent in Kiev reports thousands of people are gathering in downtown Kiev. They're all asking the same thing of the president: sign the association agreement with the EU. There are artists, intellectuals, but also people from neighboring countries, because they think that this could not only change things in Ukraine, but also elsewhere.
Euronews, Kiev, Maidan.
Despite last-minute attempts by European leaders to save the trade deal with Ukraine, there was no signature on the dotted line. As the summit in the Lithuanian capital Vilnius came to an end, both sides stressed the door remains open to signing an agreement in the future.
We know how much Ukrainian people feels European, how much they care about Europe. We will, of course, now pursue our conversations with our Ukrainian partners, knowing well that we should always respect Ukraine's sovereign decisions. The fact that we have a strategic partnership with Russia does not mean that when we are dealing with another country, we can accept any kind of third-party involvement in a bilateral relationship. What we cannot accept is a condition on a bilateral agreement to have a kind of a possible veto of a third country.
The Lithuanian president added that pressure from Russia was not a good enough reason to not sign.
I want to say that external pressure cannot be used as excuse for the decisions of sovereign country. And our experience of Lithuania, for example, showed that if you have political will to resist and not to give in, pressures are not working.
Russia has called on EU leaders to stop criticising Ukraine's decision, saying the deal would have been a major threat to Russia's economy, as our Euronews correspondent in Vilnius explains.
It's unlikely that all this fighting talk from EU officials will carry much weight inside the Kremlin. Remember, in 2005, Vladimir Putin was the man who described the collapse of the USSR as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He sees keeping these ex-Soviet republics within Moscow's sphere of influence as a means of restoring Russia to its former glory. James Franey, Euronews in Vilnius, Lithuania.
A miracle didn't happen, and European Union leaders and Ukraine have, as expected, failed to sign an historic free trade deal after a last-minute U-turn from Kiev. Ukraine's President Viktor Yanucovych still attended the Eastern Partnership Summit in Vilnius, but under economic pressure from Moscow, he's revived trade talks with Russia, and nothing the EU said could make him change his mind.
We want to have a strong relationship with Ukraine. We believe particularly on economic issues, much to be done together to the benefit of the people of Ukraine and to the benefit of the European Union. It is, of course, for Ukraine to decide what it wishes to do, and there have been some good and important discussions with President Yanucovych here. What I would say is that the European Union's door is open.
Georgia and Moldova have signed initial political association agreements, but the focus had been on Ukraine's association deal. Its decision not to sign was strongly criticized by the leader of summit host Lithuania, which holds the EU presidency.
I think that Ukrainian people are disappointed. It's not about Europe to be disappointed. I think that today's Ukrainian leadership choosing the way which is going nowhere.
As night fell and any chance of a deal evaporated, Ukrainian protesters outside the venue desperately called for a change of heart. Yanucovych, sign, they cried.
In Ukraine, confirmation of the decision not to sign up to closer ties with the EU has brought more people onto the streets of the capital Kiev on both sides of the east-west tug-of-war. Pro-European demonstrators continued their round-the-clock protest, angry at Viktor Yanucovych for shelving the planned association agreement. Some shouted coward when they heard the news from Vilnius. The protesters say they still want Ukraine to embrace Europe. We'll stay here until we win. We are many in number and they can't beat us. We've been with Russia for a long time, but we couldn't achieve anything. They think we're like a little brother, but we're an independent country and we want to live better. Less than a kilometre away, a counter-demonstration formed in support of the decision to walk away from the EU deal. Many had reportedly been bussed in from the east of the country, where pro-Russian sentiment is strong. We're not against a deal with the EU, just not at any price. The right moment hasn't yet come. There's a right time for everything. We came today because we care about the future of our country. We think European integration is not necessary for us at the moment, so we came to support the president. Evidence of an anti-EU campaign has been visible in Kiev, with posters warning that closer ties would bring job cuts, high prices and gay marriage. Ukraine has made its decision, but public opinion remains highly divided. President Viktor Yanucovych has said he's only suspending, not cancelling, Ukraine's planned deal on closer ties with the EU and still intends to sign an agreement at a later date. Previously, he'd rejected an EU loan offer as inadequate. Now the president expanded on comments made on his website, where he said several crucial steps needed to be made before the country was ready to sign an association accord. There's no change to our plans. We think we can sign once we get down to work and find solutions for economic problems. When we get the opportunity to sign a strategic partnership agreement with Russia and everything else that we need to do, so that normal relations can be established between the European Union, Russia and Ukraine. This is our responsibility.
Нормальные отношения в формате Европейский Союз, Россия, Украина – это наша обязанность.